Right then, team, let's get straight into it. So in this section, I'm going to be taking us through the indications for RSI and an overview of what this process actually involves. All of the detail around those different elements will be coming though, so don't worry about that. So in this course, we're going to be looking at intubation both in cardiac arrest and as part of a rapid sequence induction or RSI of anaesthesia. And the thing about all of the content today is that it's all applicable to everyone involved in emergency airway care, irrespective of the actual role you are performing as part of the team caring for those patients. So for example, you will be a better intubator if you understand about the importance of positioning, but you will also be a better airway assistant if you understand about laryngoscopy, because you will be one step ahead. And crucially, don't ever forget that everyone in that team has a role to play in keeping that patient safe. Now, just before we go on, I thought I might need to briefly touch on the elephant in the room here. So, intubation in cardiac arrest. And we know that the role of intubation in cardiac arrest has changed as we have begun to incorporate new evidence into all of our practice. Now, specifically, Airways 2 demonstrated that using an endotracheal tube or a supraglottic airway both resulted in similar rates of favourable neurological recovery. But this study was looking at the initial management of that cardiac arrest airway, not the ongoing management for prolonged cardiac arrest or for those who we achieve ROSCIN. So we still definitely believe that intubation has a role to play in arrest management, but just that the role is a bit more focused than it used to be, and it should be performed by someone with training and regular exposure to that skill. And whilst we can't help you out with the regular exposure bit, unfortunately, we definitely have loads in this course that will help out with your approach. So now that's out of the way, let's talk a little about RSI. RSI has been around for over 50 years now after first being described by Stept and Safar in 1970. There are a few different definitions out there in the literature, but the one I like the best, I think, is this one by Clucker and colleagues, which was published in 2020. So they describe it as a set of actions during induction of anaesthesia in unfasted patients or patients at risk of aspiration or regurgitation of gastric contents. The reason I particularly like this is that it tells you that it's not one thing. An RSI isn't just one thing, it is a set of actions. And it alludes to the fact that you have a patient who might be unfasted and they are at risk of aspiration. So pretty tidy, that one, I think. Now, the goal of RSI is to secure a definitive airway by passing a cuff tube through the vocal cords on the very first attempt and with zero complications. So no hypoxia, no hypotension, none of that stuff. But to do that, you need to not only be an expert in the actual intubation part, as a team, you need to set the environment, you need to have the right equipment, you need to choose the optimal drug strategy, and by doing that, you're going to make it look as easy as possible. And it's about making it slick, it's about making it feel easy, and it's about getting the right results, even if events are conspiring against us in that particular case. Now, sadly, it's not always as straightforward as that, though. NAP4, or the Fourth National Audit Project of the Royal College of Anaesthetists and Difficult Airway Society, provided some pretty stark figures back in 2011. At least 1 in 4 major airway events occurred in the emergency setting, so that's all of us involved in that, and most of these events were complications of an RSI. Now, the common themes that they found in that study was that there was a poor identification of patients that were going to be risky. There was poor or incomplete planning. There was inadequate provision of skilled staff and equipment to manage these adverse events successfully. There was often delayed recognition of adverse events. And there was failed rescue due to a lack or failure of interpretation of capnography. And as a final point, it was made very clear that there were definitely avoidable deaths due to airway complications in the emergency care setting. Thankfully, we're going to be covering all of those common themes today. Now let's start thinking about this in a bit more detail. So when are we going to need to perform an RSI? What are the indications? Well, there is a very handy A to E list that was recently published by Avery and colleagues. They mention A, so loss of airway patency, and that's either actual or potential. They mention B, so inadequate ventilation, respiratory failure or hypoxia. C, to improve oxygen delivery in hypovolemia or to allow hemorrhage control procedures to be undertaken. D, neuroprotection, particularly in those cases of traumatic brain injury or in patients with a reduced Glasgow Coma Score or in status epilepticus and, of course, in our post-cardiac arrest protection patients. E stands for everything else, so things like emergency surgery, humanitarian considerations, temperature control, so things like serotonin syndrome, or to facilitate safe transfer or to facilitate imaging, so think of those patients with those combative head injuries. So it's definitely not just the A and B, or the airway and breathing problems, that we might initially have in the front of our mind when we think about the indications. It's about more than that. So if we've got a patient who needs an RSI, what are the steps involved? Or as the definition would say, what are the set of actions? Well, firstly, it's about briefing the team, making a plan and ensuring everyone is on the same page, so sharing that mental model. As part of this, you're going to be allocating roles, and two roles which we will be referring back to a lot on this course is Operator 1 and Operator 2. Now, Operator 1, this is the person who is going to be performing the intubation. So they're up there at the head. And then there is Operator 2. So this is that absolutely critical person who is going to be their airway assistant. And who fulfills these different roles, so Operator 1 or Operator 2, will be determined by the case that you've got, the experience levels within your team, the skill set that they've each got, etc., etc. So it will be changeable, and we'll discuss this a bit more later. Now, once your plan is sorted, then it's time to get set up. So this is going to involve preparing the patient, preparing the equipment, and preparing the drugs. After that, we'll be running through our checklist, followed by the administration of those drugs. Now, in the period between the drugs going in and them taking effect, if appropriate, then we're going to be providing some gentle ventilations alongside our apneic oxygenation. Only then, after we've waited for those drugs to kick in, do we undertake laryngoscopy, which Simon will be talking us through later. Fingers crossed, hopefully we're going to get ourselves a fantastic view because we've prepared so well, and that will make it relatively easy to intubate that patient. Following that tube going through the cords, we're going to be confirming that it's in the correct spot. So firstly, it's about seeing it pass through those cords. Secondly, it's about misting of the tube. Thirdly, it's about regular waveform capnography. And finally, about auscultation. And then, after we've done all of those steps, it's about pushing on and getting that patient to the next stage of their care. Of course, though, if we are unsuccessful with our intubation attempt, then we will need to have a really clear strategy for what the next steps are. And James is going to be taking through that in just a few minutes. So all of these steps that we've got here are to try and prevent failure, but we will also be prepared for failure, and we're going to have a clear plan if it does occur. So actually, the intubation part of this is only one element in a much, much bigger process. And we need to pay attention to every step of this process with the same amount of detail as that crucial passing of the tube. The only time we should really be deviating from this process is in a cardiac arrest, as then we don't need to give the drugs, but all of the other elements should remain.
All right, lovely. Nice introduction, Rob. Thanks ever so much. But mate, listen, we're pretty well known for being evidence-based. So NAP4 2011, what's going on there, mate? It's a bit old, isn't it?
It's still valid. It's still valid. Surely, you can still get away with that as a reference. But yeah, that is a good point. And, I think I can get away with it with my older references. It is a seminal piece of work, though.
Oh, okay. Seminal, yep.
That helps. Essentially, really, though, I mean, in all fairness, there hasn't been a repeat done, but there has been some smaller scale studies done, particularly one in the Thames Valley region, and that was published in 2022 by Cumberworth in the Anaesthesia Journal. Now, this wasn't, unfortunately, specifically looking at the incidence of airway complications in the emergency setting, but they found that the overall incidence of serious airway complications in the elective setting was at least as high as it was in NAP4, potentially even higher. But remember that it's the whole package we need to be getting right here. And specifically looking at ED studies, there are lots of observational bits and bobs out there, but the Ocean study published in SJ Trem in 2019 is worth mentioning, I think. And this was a single centre observational study in Germany. They found some pretty unpleasant findings, to be honest with you. So over 40% of patients had some sort of complication with their RSI. So 20% had hypotension, 10% had an episode of hypoxia, and 5% had an esophageal intubation. So whilst we definitely closed the safety gap a bit for rapid sequence induction RSI, and I do think things have definitely improved in emergency airway care in my career, but I also definitely think there is more work to do, particularly around education, and hopefully we can continue on that path to improvement.
Okay, nice. Well, you pretty much rescued yourself from from my little dig there, Rob. Well done.
Partially, maybe.
Well, I think partially is right, because there was a lot of ED and in-hospital stuff there, and there's a lot of pre-hospital folk listening into this. So, have you got any data for us on the pre-hospital setting?
So predictable. I'm ready for you, mate. I'm ready for you. So there was actually, yeah. So there's a nice paper from about 5 years ago from Sydney Hems, and this reported complications actually, and that occurred in around 25% of their cases. The most common reason being desaturation, which occurred in about 17% of what they did and saw. There was another paper from Ambulance Victoria looking at the performance of intensive care flight paramedics, and they found complications in around 6.6 of cases. So that was both hypoxia and hypotension. So they were quite different, these studies, in terms of outright numbers. But I think, the key thing here is that whether you work in the pre-hospital environment or in the ED or in both, what is key here is that you need to be monitoring the performance of your service so that you can compare the incidence of these key metrics to other places and see how you're performing. And if necessary, you need to look at other services and find ways of improving what's going on. So it's a continual improvement process, and monitoring, I think, that's the key, whether you're in hospital or in the ED.